Welcome to Inside Ag from Kansas Farm Bureau, the voice of agriculture. I'm Shelby Varner. Kansas Farm Bureau's annual meeting is happening at the beginning of December in Manhattan, and the keynote speaker for that event is Chris Kuehl, who is a managing director of Armada Corporate Intelligence. Chris is here to join us today and talk a little bit about what he might be doing at the meeting. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Before we get started, could you share a little bit about yourself and your history?
I am an economist. I always feel like I'm at an AA meeting when I start that way. Like I'm an economist, I'm sorry. So I have been a lifelong Midwestern resident, lifelong resident of Kansas City. I've lived on both Missouri and Kansas sides. I've been on the Kansas side now for 35, 40 years. So I have a lot of familiarity. I have legitimate connections to the agricultural community because my grandson is a large animal veterinarian. So I get a chance to hear about all the travails that affect the livestock industry. One of the interesting things about my background, at least interesting to me, and I think relevant as we start this presentation in December, is that back in the 1980s, I started out as a Soviet specialist. I was going to be a spook. I was going to work for the CIA. I got a degree in Soviet studies. I learned Russian. And then, of course, they went out of business in the middle of my PhD. But now that the Cold War is back, I suddenly feel relevant again. And obviously, what's been going on in Ukraine has been affecting the globe economically, and it has certainly affected the agricultural sector. So that's kind of why I think I've been invited to address the group in December, and I'm looking forward to it.
Obviously, a lot of knowledge that you carry with yourself. Talking a little bit real fast about what's happening in the US and the ag industry and rural communities with drought, supply chain issues, inflation, housing, and labor. Could you touch a little bit on those topics and the impact that you're seeing?
The agricultural sector always ends up feeling whatever mood the economy is in. So at times there's boom, at times there's bust. Right now, you're dealing with a lot of issues that have kind of converged on the ag sector. You talked about supply chain, you talked about the housing issue, you talked about labor, you talked about the impact of inflation, potential for recession. All of those things have kind of a unique impact on the rural community. For example, the supply chain is something that is altering drastically. We are now losing a lot of faith in the old just-in-time system. A lot of activity moving that supply chain back to the United States. Reshoring now is a real thing. You're beginning to see a significant amount of migration back to the United States. And a lot of that, at least as far as the manufacturers are concerned, is going into the rural areas. It's a lot easier for them to reestablish in smaller cities, smaller towns, than trying to figure out how to do that move back to a bigger city. I think if you look at Kansas, you can see the expansion in places like Great Bend and the expansions out in western Kansas. I was giving a talk not that long ago out in the Goodland area, and an awful lot of activity around food processing, even high tech, because the workforce in the rural areas is still sparse, but it's often a harder working workforce, and that really appeals to a lot of companies that are making that migration. You're also seeing a lot of reaction to what normally drives the farm sector, and that is weather. The drought situation is not something that can be altered, and it's not something that is a big surprise, but it changes the way people react, and it changes their expectations going forward. Even as we start today's interview, the big news has been the change in policy when it comes to OPEC and oil prices. And this is something also that affects the agricultural sector. It's no surprise that the oil producers are trying to defend $80 a barrel oil because that's where their profit margins are the healthiest. But that cascades very directly into agriculture. The ag sector has been seeing good prices for the food that's produced because we do have the absence of Russian and Ukrainian supply. but the input costs have been very high. We've been seeing higher oil prices, which translate into higher fuel prices. So the farmers are like, well, yeah, it's good news and I'm getting more per bushel, but it's not such good news and I'm paying more per gallon. So those are some of the things that we'll go into a little bit more depth on in December. But I was joking with you earlier that by the time we get to December, I'll have 27 hours worth of content and 60 minutes in which to deliver it. So that should be interesting.
Means it should be a fulfilled 1 hour of information that will be
Yes,
top notch.
that's correct. We hope.
I'm sure it will be. Another thing to talk about, Chris, is that the Supreme Court is back in session and they're looking at water in the US. What water are they looking at and how can that affect the ag
Yeah, I mean,
industry?
it's like water has become the kind of oil of the future, that we now know that we are running up against some pretty significant barriers when it comes to water supply, particularly in the Southwest and in the West in general. And you suddenly have lots of conversation about how to use water, who's going to get access to water, what sort of environmental concerns are going to have to be addressed. When you start looking at the variety of theoretical solutions to all this, it's really quite amazing, because you've got everything from the rail sector exploring the possibility of shipping water by rail from the middle of the country to the west. You have conversations about building an aqueduct that would connect the Great Lakes to Lake Mead. I mean, these are just massive undertakings. I don't have a lot of faith that they're going to happen anytime soon, but it's one of those conversations that has been somewhat overdue. The Kansas aquifer is not as plentiful as it once was. A lot more conversation about how do we conserve it? Is there going to be a push for more dry land farming? How is it going to affect what farmers and ranchers do as far as their production is concerned? The farmers have always been very conservation oriented. They have always treated water as a precious resource. So it's a little bit annoying for the rest of the country to say, hey, why aren't you conserving? We have always conserved. Why aren't you? So a lot of conversation around, I mean, this is not as intense here as it's been on the western areas, but conversations about, you're telling us to not use water for agriculture. Why don't you stop watering the golf courses first? Because, we don't really eat what comes off the golf course. So it's a controversy. The way the Supreme Court is going to attack it, I'm sure, is piecemeal, because they only really react to whatever the suit is that is being brought before them. Eventually, it's going to be something that state legislatures and the national legislature will have to get engaged in.
A lot of interesting and important information that can impact here in America. Talking about some international stuff that's happening that could also impact us. You have background in some Soviet and Asian studies, and I think that's important as we talk about some turmoil that's been happening in Russia and Ukraine, the different ways that that could play out. How could that affect us?
Yeah, it's already affected us pretty dramatically. We know that Russia and Ukraine combined were accounting for about 25% of the world wheat production, something around 15% of the world corn production. So when that came off the market effectively, it had to be replaced by somebody else. Many of the countries that would have stepped in to replace that have been protective. For example, Argentina produces a lot of wheat and corn and soybeans, but they have installed very strict export controls and trying not to see that surplus come out of their country. Now, that's had exactly the opposite reaction in Argentina, because the farmers have simply refused to produce, saying, well, if you can't sell it, then what's the point of producing it? So another situation where people don't really understand the farm market very well. We're also seeing a lot of change as far as China is concerned. China is only about 20% independent when it comes to its soybean consumption. It has to bring in most of its food, and it brings it in from all over. It brings it from the US, brings it from Canada, Australia, Latin America, anywhere they can buy it. This has always been a huge security concern for China. Just recently, their own Defense Department did a study that said that if for some reason China was ever to be cut off from U.S. agricultural exports, they would have food riots immediately. They would literally be dealing with a revolutionary atmosphere. And this report pointed out that every overthrow of every Chinese government in 2,500 years has been stimulated by food riots. This is a country that is very, very sensitive to that. They're trying to produce their own, but not with a population of, 1.4 billion people. Most of the U.S. export is oriented to countries like China. We do not consume the vast majority of the food we grow. We are basically selling it to everyone. I always point out that Kansas is the sixth largest export state in the United States because of the ag output. We try desperately to eat all the food that we produce. I think we're the 11th fattest state in the country, but eventually, we have to sell it. So we are doing that. The Chinese are buying a lot of it. India buys a lot of it. So what happens internationally honestly affects the farm sector in Kansas almost more than any other sector. The manufacturers, transportation, they're all somewhat engaged in global trade, but when it comes to global activity, the farm sector is at the top of the list.
Chris, we've talked about a lot of different things that are happening and can be affecting the ag industry, Kansas, America, really the whole world. As that, you've seen there's just been a lot of turmoil in the last few years. Are we in a period of perpetual disruption, or do you think things are eventually going to smooth out?
Well, when you look at the farm sector, they really kind of live in a permanent state of insecurity because you can't control what's going to happen with the weather. So every year, farmers have to gamble. Every year, they have to decide what is going to be supportive as far as my agricultural plans are concerned. They're having to worry about what their crops are going to do. They're going to have to worry about all of that aspect, but then they also have to worry about demand. What is the consumer going to be interested in purchasing? What is going to change as far as their food habits are concerned? And this is going to affect the livestock industry. It affects what decisions are made regarding what kind of food. And then we also have to remember that Kansas is a major food processor. So the processing operations, which is the heart of Kansas manufacturing, trying to anticipate what the consumer wants. Is there going to be more activity? For example, in the last couple of years, we had a reduction in restaurant attendance because of COVID, which has now come back. So what does that mean? What are people interested in eating? Is inflation going to affect people's decisions about going out to eat? What generational differences are there? So there's a certain amount of, I guess, perpetual questioning that just revolves around agriculture. Not that all businesses don't face that same dilemma, but I think the farm sector has less control over its inputs than a lot of other sectors. They're trying to second guess and they have to make decisions far in advance. I mean, you're thinking now about what you're going to do in the spring and what you're going to do in the summer. You're trying to anticipate what prices are going to be for a harvest that's a year away. And that's tricky. And this is one of the reasons that farmers either go insane or become very, very calm and centered. You have to kind of choose one or the other approach.
For those in the farm sector in rural America, do you have any quick pieces of advice you would give them to continue to navigate this time now and in the future?
I think the most important advice is to be flexible and opportunistic, which farmers have always been. But as we go forward, you're going to see changes happening a little more rapidly than they have in the past. For example, our relationship with China is going to change drastically in the years to come. For years, we sort of thought of China as maybe 50% friend, 50% rival. They're now clearly 80 to 90% rival, 10% friend. that market is not one that's going to likely to grow. So we end up looking for other alternatives. Russia is going to be isolated from the world economy for a long time to come, and that's going to affect the output that comes from that part of the world. At the same time, we have lots of expansion going on in areas that we haven't paid as much attention to globally. Places like Latin America, places like Africa. Africa is now seen as what China was 25 years ago. Population is about the same size now. It's becoming highly urbanized. The African population is the youngest population in the world. Almost half the population is under the age of 30, and many of them are educated and they're changing their lifestyle. So the opportunities are there, but exploiting them is challenging. These are new markets and new opportunities. And then when it comes to the flexibility, it's reacting to the changes that we've already talked about. Oil prices becoming much more volatile, worrying about water, worrying about labor. How do you get people to continue to engage in the agricultural sector, both as farmers and in the food processing business? I mentioned earlier that my grandson's a large animal veterinarian. And when he moved into his community in mid-Missouri, I mean, the local population was ecstatic because, oh my God, a 30-something veterinarian? Are you kidding me? I think the average age of the veterinarians in that area was 193. I mean, it was like, it is an area where it's just you don't have enough. And it's becoming paramount for states that depend on the ag sector to support the ag sector. So it's making sure that we continue with the kind of interactions that Kansas has always enjoyed with places like Kansas State and various community colleges, trying to convince people that there's a legitimate reason to remain in the agricultural sector and in the farm sector. If there's one piece of good news, though, it is that small town living is becoming more popular. It's being described as the HGTV effect. People have watched enough of these shows like the one that's in Laurel, Mississippi, and everyone wants to be like Aaron and Ben and live in this idyllic Mississippi. It's the fastest growing town in Mississippi now. And it's kind of in the middle of nowhere, but you're seeing that kind of excitement and development in parts of Kansas as well. You know, Wamego kind of building itself around the Oz winery, and people laughed at the beginning, but it's like, nope, it's a real thing. And you're starting to see that kind of behavior throughout the state.
And Chris, is there anything in conclusion that you would like to share with the listeners right now?
Now, I think in conclusion, it's understanding that agriculture is a complicated sector. People, when they think about it, kind of get stuck on the actual farming part. And all they really see is like, okay, it's lots of fields and we grow wheat and we have cows and gee, that's as far as it goes. But a tremendous amount of agriculture is in the processing part and the distribution part. And that's often what really drives what happens with the farm sector is understanding kind of what to do with the food between when it's grown and when it's consumed, and also recognizing the importance of consumer mood and trend. You know, we have a consumer public now that's increasingly made up of kind of the millennial Gen Z generation, and they have different eating habits. They're more interested in farm to table. They're more interested in organic. They're more interested in foods that are healthy and perhaps not as processed as they've been in the past, but they also want those to be really cheap. And so the farmer comes back and says, okay, I can kind of give you one or the other. I can either make it really cheap or I can make it really specific and organic and all the rest of that, but that's not always cheap. And so it's trying to balance those desires. And as with always the case with the ag sector, it's trying to educate that population that isn't rural, that isn't agriculture, as to how that system works and how it is that they get food on their table when it started someplace on a farm in Kansas.
Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to hop on the podcast and share some of your knowledge with our listeners.
Thank you.
That was Chris Kuehl, a managing director at Armada Corporate Intelligence. If you're interested in hearing more information on these topics and others, I recommend you look into attending Kansas Farm Bureau's annual meeting that is taking place December 3rd through the 5th here in Manhattan, Kansas. To find out more information, you can go to www.kfb.org/annual meeting. I'm Shelby Varner, and this has been Inside Ag from Kansas Farm Bureau, the voice of agriculture.